Our next speaker is another historian, Tim Brook from the University of British Columbia, my colleague there, although he is in the Department of History and I reside in Geography. That hasn't stopped us encountering each other occasionally on the campus. It's an honor to have Tim as a colleague, as indeed to see him here inducted into the Royal Society, because Tim is perhaps the outstanding historian of modern China in the English-speaking world. His work is translated into many languages. It is held in very high esteem by sinologists everywhere. And what has been described as his joyful and comprehensive scholarship is much appreciated by those who work on early modern China. But Tim has, in recent years, I won't say abandoned the archives, but adopted a different style of presentation of his work. He hit the headlines and attracted a wide public audience for his book, Vermeer's Hat, which some of you may have encountered, which told the story of early globalization, in a sense, and demonstrated the ways in which historical perspective could speak to contemporary concerns. Most recently, Tim has authored a book that takes his interests more directly back to China on Mr. Sheldon's map, the first great map of early China. But I'm going to let him speak about his work rather than continue. This is a product of having to introduce a colleague whom one knows, I won't say rather too well, but well enough to be very proud to be able to do this. Thanks, Tim.
I had the privilege of sitting on a committee that Graham chaired, so I'm going to get out my stopwatch here because I know that if I don't do this right, I'm in trouble. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening. I thought in 7 minutes, what can you do? Either you have to go forward or go back, and so I'm going to look back. I'm a sinologist, and probably all of you in the room could provide a definition of that, but step outside the academy and nobody knows what we do. We're a very small group, we who study China. And when I made that decision in my last year as an undergraduate at the University of Toronto, I was advised that this was a bad career move. Nobody was interested in China. China didn't matter. My interest in China, it was a kind of congruence of many things that concerned me as somebody who was alive in the late 60s and early 70s, as I suppose everyone in this room was. A concern for the problem of the ill distribution of political power, a concern for the lives of ordinary people, a concern for human rights. And all of those, it's not as though I looked around and said, given those concerns, what should I do? It was more a kind of serendipity that I got involved in China. But I think what I was looking for was difference. And this is one of the problems if you're stepping outside your own cultural framework and seeking to understand another. And there are a lot of problems with seeking difference. But I was seeking difference at the time. I was trying to imagine a way in which societies and people could exist socially, culturally, and politically. And so I became very interested in Buddhism as a different kind of metaphysic rather than the one in which most of us were trained and grew up. And this has been a kind of a continuing interest of mine. Even though I'm a social and cultural historian of China in the 16th and 17th centuries, I have an ongoing interest in trying to think about how can we get out of certain kinds of, I guess I have to say, metaphysical fixations that are deeply embedded in Western culture. And here I'm thinking of Christendom, Islam, and Judaism, all monotheistic and therefore all in some ways tied to certain kinds of understandings of action and of personality that shift when you step into a Buddhist framework. Now, I'm not a Buddhist, I'm not anything, I'm just a 21st century Canadian. But I think this is what I was kind of drawn to, kind of another way of thinking about the world. And ended up going to China. Unfortunately, my stopwatch is defying me here, so, there we go. I still have a good amount of time. I ended up going to China. I was going to study the formation of the early Buddhist church in China, which happens in the 2nd, 3rd centuries AD, and I was sort of swept up by a professor in Shanghai who was a specialist in literature and drew me to the writings of the 16th and 17th century, which then became the field in which I've mostly worked. But I've tried to keep 3 strands going. I think about social and cultural questions and the way in which societies and the opportunities that people have are determined by cultural and social structures. And so I've written many books on Ming society as a kind of a very dynamic moment in Chinese history when all of those things are in question. And in fact, if it hadn't been for the invasion of the Manchus in the 1640s, I think Chinese history as we understand it would have been extremely different. So that's one thing I've done. I'm interested as well in the suspension of political process under military occupation. I wrote a book on the Japanese occupation of China during World War II. And that has led me into questions of international law and tribunals that are conducted at the end of violent events. I've also had an ongoing interest in human rights issues. I wrote a book on the massacre in Tiananmen in 1989 and continue to be loosely involved with Amnesty International and some of its work on human rights. And then, as Graham said, I sometimes thought that I should look out the window from the archive and see what was going on in the broader world of readers, because no matter how much I write for the 5 people who find what I do interesting, I feel I should go out beyond that scope. So this was partly driven by the fact of being a China historian through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, when you're a minority in a history department where most people are doing Canadian, American, European history. So I found as a young assistant professor, if I talked about Chinese history, I couldn't get a hearing. But if I talked about broader issues that I felt I could come to with difference, with another way of seeing, with another position from which to begin, you could start conversations. And so I sort of moved in that way in my writings. The book called Vermeer's Hat is a bit of a dirty trick because you don't know when you pick it up in the bookstore that it's actually about Chinese history. You think it's about Vermeer. And it's arguably about both, but what it is about the way in which the 17th century was a moment in which difference was a starting point for people to begin to try and grasp what they had in common with each other. Few were very good at understanding this idea of commonality, and they mostly did it through trade. That is, I give you something I value at X, you give me something you value at X. And through that process, there's a kind of common value established that I think one of my friends said, one of the problems with your work is that you're too cheerful about the commercial world. But I think you have to be at an earlier stage in human history because that's how people met, that's how people interacted. The most recent book is an attempt to, well, I take a map, a Chinese map that turned up in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, deposited there in 1659, a map that conforms to no Chinese cartographic conventions whatsoever, but was made by a Chinese. And it leads me to think about, well, what are Chinese maps doing in England? What are English people doing in Asia? And how has that created the beginning of a kind of interactive intercultural history that we are all heir to? The great burden I think the world faces today is that we're all locked into these national categories. And when threatened, wave national flags. And I'm afraid there's a lot of misplaced anxiety. There's probably some good anxiety about China in China's future in the world, but I think there's a lot of misplaced anxiety as well. And so I see my role as a China historian to try and create innovative ways to relax everyone about China and actually try and understand the history that connects us and China. Thank you.
Again, we will have opportunity for just a
killed the house, didn't it?
You talked about the hazards of seeking difference. Did difference come to you in ways that gave you pause and also impetus to go forward?
Yes, you're absolutely right. I went to China in 1974 and spent 2 years there, and difference came to me in a big way. Just, being 6'2", white and bearded was enough to put a billion people off. And in fact, what I had to do, and I was originally only going to stay for a year, and I decided I needed 2 because I had to understand how do I create grounds in order to discover similarity with the people around me. It means becoming fluent in the language. It means, in fact, I think my personality changes when I'm in a Chinese milieu speaking Chinese, because you have to diminish difference. And so the struggle over similarity and difference, I mean, it's an ongoing one in all societies. It's certainly ongoing within Canadian society. And I think difference is where you begin to learn. You begin to realize not everybody was born in Toronto in 1951 to English immigrants, as I was. There is a broader range of possibilities out there in the world. And so I think going out to the difference and then from that difference and coming back and trying to figure out, okay, what do we have in common that we can begin to speak to each other? And I would say that monotheism is not terrific in enabling people to do that, because there's lots of gods out there, and they should all snuggle up to each other.